The reference. Hello readers, welcome back to Reads with Room B with me, Room B, and
Robert.
Robert will be taking over from Douglas H, who had to step away from the project due to health reasons. So yes, you'll be seeing a lot more of this young man as he and I work our way through Oliver Twist. Yay! This is the edition that we are reading. It is the full script. So, yeah, check it out. Read along with us. Today we will be doing chapters 2 and 3. Right, let's start our story. Chapter 2 treats of Oliver Twist's growth, education, and board. For the next 8 or 10 months, Oliver was the victim of a systematic course of treachery and deception. He was brought up by the hand. The hungry and destitute of the situation of an infant orphan was duly reported by the workhouse authorities and to the parish authorities. The parish authorities inquired with dignity of the workhouse authorities whether there was no female then domiciled in the house who was in a situation to impart Oliver Twist the consolation and nourishment of which he stood in need. The workhouse authorities replied with humility that there was not. Upon this, the parish authorities magnanimously and humanely resolved that Oliver should be farmed, or in other words, that he should be dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rolled about the floor all day, without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing, under the parental supersedence of an elderly female, who received the culprits and for the consideration of 7 pence halfpenny per small head per week. 7 pence halfpenny's worth per week is a good round diet for a child. A great deal may be got for 7 pence halfpenny, quite enough to overload its stomach and make it uncomfortable. The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for children. She had a very accurate perception of what was good for herself, and so she appropriated the greater part of the weekly stipend for her own use, and consigned the rising parochial generation to an even shorter allowance than was originally provided for them.
Thereby finding in the lowest depths deeper still, proving herself a very great experimental philosopher. Everybody knows the story of another experimental philosopher who had a great theory about a horse being able to live without eating, and who demonstrated it so well that he got his own horse down to a straw a day, and would most unquestionably have rendered him a very spirited and rampacious animal on nothing at all if he had not died just 24 hours before he was to have his first comfortable bait of air. Unfortunately for the experimental philosopher of the female to whose unfortunately for the whose protecting care for Oliver Twist was delivered over a similar result, usually attended the operation of her system. For all that the very moment when a child had contrived to exist upon the smallest possible portions of the weakest possible food, it did
perversely happen in 8.5 cases out of 10, either that it sickened from want and cold, or fell into the fire from neglect, or got half smothered by accident. In any one of these cases which the miserable little being was usually summoned into another world, and there gathered to the fathers which it had never known in this.
Occasionally, when there was some more than usual interesting inquest upon a parish child who had been overlooked in turning up a bedstead, or inadvertently scalded to death, when there happened to be a washing through the latter.
Though the latter accident was very scarce, anything approaching to a washing being of rare occurrence in the farm. The jury would take it into their heads to ask troublesome questions, or the parishioners would rebelliously affix their signatures to a remonstrance. But these impertinences were speedily checked by the evidence of the surgeon and the testimony of the beadle, the former of whom had always opened the body and found nothing inside, which is very probable indeed, and the latter of whom invariably swore whatever the parish wanted, which was very self-devotional.
Besides, the board made periodical pilgrimages to the farm, and always sent the beadle the day before to say they were going. The children were neat and clean to behold when they went, and what more would the people have?
It cannot be expected that this system of farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxuriant crop. Oliver Twist's 9th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference. But nature or inheritance had implanted a good, sturdy spirit in Oliver's breast, and it had plenty of room to expand, thanks to the spare diet of the establishment, and perhaps to the circumstance which may be attributed his having any 9th birthday at all. Be this as it may, however, it was a 9th birthday, and he was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, who, after participating with him in a sound thrashing, had been locked up therein for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Miss Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beadle, striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate.
"Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir?"
said Miss Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in well-affected ecstasies of joy.
"Susan, take Oliver and them 2 brats upstairs, and wash 'em directly. My heart alive, Mr. Bumble, how glad am I to see you, surely."
Now Mr. Bumble was a fat man and choleric, so instead of responding to this open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicket a tremendous shake, and then bestowed upon it a kick which could only have emanated from no leg but a beadle's.
"Lor, only think,"
said Miss Mann, running out, for 3 boys had been removed by this time.
"Only think of that I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on the inside, on account of them dear children walking in, sir. Walk in, pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir."
Although the invitation was accompanied with a curtsy that might have softened the heart of a churchwarden, it by no means mollified the beadle.
"Do you think this respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann?"
inquired Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane.
"Do you think the parish officer waiting at your garden gate, when they come here upon partial business connected with the parochial orphans, are you aware, Miss Mann, that you are, as I may, a parochial delegate and a stipendary?"
"I'm sure, Mr. Bumble, that I was only a-telling 1 or 2 of the dear children as is so fond of you that you was a-comin',"
replied Mrs. Mann, with a great humility. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his orchestral power and his importance. He had displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed.
"Well, Miss Mann,"
he replied in a calmer tone, it may be as you say. It may be. Lead the way in, Miss Mann, for I have come on business, and I have something to say." Mrs. Mann ushered the beadle into the small parlour with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. Mr. Bumble wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his walk had engendered. Yeah. Glanced complacently at the cocked hat and smiled. Yes, he smiled. Beetles are but men, and Mr. Bumble smiled.
Now don't you be offended at what I'm going to say,
observed Mrs. Mann, with captivating sweetness.
You've had a long walk, you know, or I wouldn't mention it. Now, will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble?
Not a drop,
said Mr. Bumble, waving his right hand in a dignified but placid manner.
I think you will,
said Miss Mann, who had noticed the tone of refusal and the gesture that had accompanied it.
Just a little drop with a little cold water and a lump of sugar.
Mr. Bumble coughed.
Now, just a little drop,
said Miss Mann persuasively.
What is it?
Inquired the beetle.
Why, it is what I'm obligated to keep a little of in my house, to put into the blessed infant's daffy, when they aren't well, Mr. Bumble,
replied Miss Mann as she opened the corner cupboard and took down a bottle and glass.
It's gin. I'll not deceive you, Mr. B. It's gin.
Do you give the children daffy, Miss Mann? Inquired
Bumble, following with his eyes the interesting process of mixing.
Ah, bless him, that I do, dear as it is,
replied the nurse.
I couldn't see him suffer before my very eyes, you know, sir.
No,
said Mr. Bumble approvingly.
No, you could not. You are a humane woman, Mrs. Mann.
Here she set down the glass.
I shall take a early opportunity to mention it to the board, Mrs. Mann.
He drew it toward him.
You feel as a mother, Mrs. Mann.
He stirred the gin and water.
I drank your health with cheerfulness, Miss Mann.
And he swallowed half of it.
And now about business,
said the beetle, taking out a leathern pocketbook.
The child that was half baptized.
Oliver Twist isn't... Yeah, that's you.
Oliver Twist is 9 years old today.
Bless him,
interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron.
And notwithstanding a offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, notwithstanding the most superlative, and I mayn't say supernatural exhortations on the part of this parish, said
Bumble.
We have never been able to discover who his father is, or what his mother's settlement was, or name, or condition.
Mrs. Mann raised her hand in astonishment, but added after a moment of reflection,
How come he to have any name at all, then?
The beetle drew himself up with a great pride and said,
I invented it.
You, Mr. Bumble?
I, Miss Mann. We name our foundlings in alphabetical order. The last one was an S. Swubble, I named him. This one was a T. Twist, I named him. The next one that comes will be Unwin, and the next Vilcanus. I have got names ready-made to the end of the alphabet, and all the way through it again when we come to Z.
Why, you're quite a literary character, sir,
said Miss Mann.
Well,
said the beetle, evidently gratified with the compliment.
Perhaps I may be, Miss Mann.
He finished the gin and water and added,
Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board has determined to have him back in the house. I have come out myself to take him there, so let me see him at once.
I'll fetch him directly, said
Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose, Oliver having had by this time as much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed as he could be scrubbed off in one washing, was led into the room by the benevolent protectress.
Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver.
Mrs. Mann, Oliver made a bow, which was divided between the beetle on the chair and the crooked hat on the table.
"Will you go along with me, Oliver?"
said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice.
Oliver was about to say that he would go along with anybody in great readiness, when glancing upwards he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the beetle's chair and was shaking her fist at him with a furious countenance. He took the hint at once, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body not to be deeply impressed upon his recollection.
"Will she go with me?"
inquired poor Oliver.
"No, she can't,
Replied Mr. Bumble.
but she'll come and see you sometimes."
This was no great consolation to the child. Young as he was, however, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was no very difficult matter for the boy to call tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill use are great assistants if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Miss Mann gave him 1,000 embraces, and what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter, lest he should seem too hungry when he got to the workhouse. With a slice of bread in his hand and a little brown cloth parish cap on his head, Oliver was led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years, and yet he burst into the agony of childish grief as the cottage gate closed after him. Wretched as were the little companions in misery he was leaving behind, they were the only friends he had ever known, and his sense of loneliness in the great wide world sank into the child's heart for the first time.
Mr. Bumble walked on with long strides. Little Oliver, firmly grasping his gold-laced cuff, trotted beside him, inquiring at the end of every quarter of a mile whether they were nearly there. To those interrogations Mr. Bumble returned very brief and snappish replies, for the temporary blandness which the gin and water awakened in some bosoms had by this time evaporated, and he once again a beetle.
Oliver had not been within the walls of the workhouse a quarter of an hour, and he had scarcely completed demolition of a second slice of bread, when Mr. Bumble, who had handed him over to the care of an old woman, returned, telling him that it was board night, and informed him that the board had said he was to appear before it forthwith. Not having a very clearly defined notion of what a live board was, Oliver was rather astounded by this intelligence, and not quite sure. Just a minute, readers. We need to wait for traffic.
1, 2, 3, 4. And off they go.
Yes. Now, back to our story. Not having a clearly defined notion of what a live board was, Oliver was rather astounded by this intelligence, and was not quite certain whether he ought to laugh or cry. He had no time to think about the matter, however, for Mr. Bumble gave him a tap upon the head with his cane to wake him up, and another on the back to make him lively, and bidding him follow, conducted him into the large whitewashed room, where 8 or 10 fat gentlemen were sitting around a table. At the top of the table, seated in an armchair, rather higher than the rest, was a particularly fat gentleman with a very round, red face.
"Bow to the board,"
said Mr. Bumble. Oliver brushed away 2 or 3 tears that were lingering in his eyes, and seeing no board but a table, fortunately bowed to that.
"What is your name, boy?"
said the gentleman in the high chair. Oliver was frightened at the sight of so many gentlemen, which made him tremble, and the beetle gave him another tap behind, which made him cry, and these 2 causes made him answer in a very low and hesitating voice, whereupon the gentleman in the white waistcoat said he was a fool, which was a capital way of raising his spirits, and putting him quite at ease.
"Boy,"
said the gentleman in the high chair.
"listen to me. You know you're an orphan, I suppose?"
"What's that, sir?"
inquired poor Oliver.
The boy is a fool. I thought he was.
said the gentleman in the white waistcoat.
Hush!
Said the gentleman who had spoken first.
You know you've got no father or mother, and that you were brought up by the parish, don't you?
Yes, sir.
Replied Oliver, weeping bitterly.
What are you crying for?
Inquired a gentleman in the white waistcoat. And to be sure, it was very extraordinary. What could the boy be crying for?
I hope you say your prayers every night.
Said another gentleman in a gruff voice.
And pray for the people who feed you and take care of you like a Christian.
Yes, sir.
Stammered the boy. The gentleman who spoke last was unconsciously right. It would have been very like a Christian, and a marvellously good Christian too, if Oliver had prayed for the people who fed and took care of him. But he hadn't, because nobody had taught him.
Well, you have come here to be educated and taught a useful trade.
Said the red-faced gentleman in the high chair.
You will begin to pick oakum tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Added the surly one in the white waistcoat.
For the combination of both these blessings in one simple process of picking oakum, Oliver bowed low by the direction of the beadle, and was hurried away to the large ward, where, on a rough bed, he sobbed himself to sleep. What a noble illustration of the tender laws of England! They let paupers sleep.
Poor Oliver. He little thought, as he lay sleeping in happy unconsciousness of all around him, that the board had that very day arrived at a decision which would exercise the most material influence all over his future fortunes. But they had, and this is what it is. The members of the board were very sage, deep, philosophical men.
Philosophical.
English is not good today.
That's fine. It's
Philosophical men.
Yes.
There we go. And when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once the ordinary folks would never had discovered the poor people like it.
This is not true.
Rubbish! It was a regular place for public entertainment. Rubbish again. for the poorer classes. A tavern where there was nothing to pay. Free booze? Never existed.
Yeah, no.
A public breakfast, dinner, tea and supper.
That did exist.
All year round though.
Yeah.
A brick and mortar asylum where it was all pay and no work.
Oh!
Said the board, looking very knowing.
We are the fellows to set this to rights. We'll stop it all in no time.
So they established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative.
For they would compel nobody, but not they.
But being starved by a gradual process in the house, or by a quick one out of it.
With this view, they contracted the waterworks to lay on an unlimited supply of water, and with a corn factory to supply periodically small quantities of oatmeal, and issued 3 meals of thin gruel every day, with an onion twice a week and half a roll on Sundays. They made a great many other wise and humane regulations, having reference to the ladies, which of course is not necessary to repeat, and kindly undertook to divorce poor married people, in consequence of the great expense of a suit in Doctors' Commons. And instead of compelling a man to support his family as they heretofore had done, they took his family away from him and made him a bachelor. There was no saying how many applicants for relief under these last two heads might have started up in all classes of society, if it had not been coupled with the workhouse. But the board were long-headed men, and had provided for this difficulty. The relief was inseparable from the workhouse, and the gruel, and the frightened people.
For the first 6 months, Oliver Twist was removed. The system was in full operation. It was rather expensive at first, in consequence of the increase in the undertaker's bill, and the necessity of taking in the clothes of all the paupers, which fluttered loosely on their waists, shrunken forms after a week or two's gruel work. But the number of workhouse inmates got thin, and well, as the paupers and the board were in ecstasies, the room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, and out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose and assisted by one or two women, ladle the gruel at meal times. Of this festive composition, each boy had one porringer, and no more, except on occasions of great public rejoice, when he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread beside. The bowls never wanted washing.
The boys polished them with their spoons till they shone again, and when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, as the spoons being nearly as large as the bowls, they would sit staring at the copper with such eager eyes as if they could have devoured the very bricks of which it was composed, employing themselves meanwhile in sucking their fingers most assiduously. The view of catching up any stray splashes of gruel that might have been cast thereon. The boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hadn't been used to this sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cook shop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy he slept next to him, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held, lots were cast of who should walk up to the master after supper and that evening and ask for more, and it fell to Oliver Twist.
The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered to each other and winked to Oliver, while his next neighbours nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and advanced to the master's basin and spoon in hand, with somewhat alarm in his own temerity.
Please, sir, I want some more.
The master was fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some 1 second, and then clung to the sport of the copper. The assistants were paralysed with wonder, the boy with fear.
What?
Said the master at length, in the faint voice.
Please, sir,
replied Oliver.
I want some more.
The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arm, and shrieked aloud for the beadle.
The board were sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Beadle rushed into the room in great excitement, and addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said,
Mr. Lumpkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more.
There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance.
For more?
Mr. Lumpkins.
Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand he's asked for more after he has eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?
He did, sir,
replied Mr. Bumble.
The boy will be hung, said
the gentleman in the white waistcoat.
I know the boy will be hung.
Nobody
controverted
the prophetic gentleman's opinion. An animated discussion took place. Oliver was ordered into
instant confinement, and the bill was and a bill was next morning pasted outside the gate, offering a reward of £5 to anyone who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. In other words, £5 and Oliver Twist were offered to any man or woman who wanted an apprentice to any trade, business, or calling.
I never was more convinced of anything in my life,
said the gentleman in the white waistcoat, as he knocked at the gate and read the bill the next morning.
I never was more convinced of anything in my life than I am that boy will come to be hung.
As I propose to show in the sequel, whether the white waistcoated gentleman was right or not, I should perhaps mar the interest of this narrative, supposing it possesses any at all, if I venture to hint, just yet, whether the life of Oliver Twist has this violent termination or not. And that is where we will leave our story for now. Join us next time, readers. Subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.